On June 1st, 1910, the Terra Nova slipped down the Thames into history. Crowds lined the docks, waving handkerchiefs, cheering for the brave men who would conquer the last unconquered place on earth. Captain Robert Falcon Scott stood on deck, confident, proud, certain of triumph. The South Pole awaited, glory awaited, immortality awaited. Not one man in that final polar party would ever return alive. This is the story of the Scott expedition, and how the most carefully planned assault on the South Pole became one of the most haunting tragedies in the history of exploration. Robert Falcon Scott was 42 years old, a Royal Navy officer with Arctic experience and burning ambition. He wasn't born an explorer. He was born ordinary, middle class, unremarkable, but he had tasted fame once before, leading the Discovery expedition to Antarctica in 1901, and fame is a drug that demands more. That first expedition had made him a hero, given him a naval promotion, filled lecture halls, but it hadn't been enough. He hadn't reached the pole. The ultimate prize remained unclaimed. By 1909, the race was heating. American Robert Peary claimed the North Pole. With the top of the world potentially conquered, every explorer's eyes turned south. The South Pole, 90 degrees south, the bottom of the earth, untouched, unknown, worth everything. Scott began planning immediately. This expedition would be different from Discovery, bigger, better equipped, more scientific, more glorious. He would reach the pole, plant the British flag, and return a legend. Simple, certain, inevitable. The reality was far more complicated. Funding came slowly, painfully. Scott spent months begging, writing letters, giving speeches, attending dinners where wealthy men listened politely and contributed sparingly. The British government offered some support but demanded the expedition be primarily scientific. Scott agreed. Of course it would be scientific. They would collect specimens, take measurements, advance human knowledge. The pole was merely one objective among many. He was lying, of course. Everyone knew it. The pole was everything. Eventually he scraped together enough money to purchase a ship. The Terra Nova, an old whaler, leaky and slow but sturdy. He crammed her with 3 years of supplies. Tons of pemmican, biscuits, fuel, scientific instruments, and animals. So many animals. Motor sledges, Siberian ponies, dogs. The motor sledges were Scott's pride. Tracked vehicles powered by engines, modern technology that would revolutionize polar travel. On paper, they were brilliant. In reality, they were experimental, untested in true Antarctic conditions. But Scott believed in progress, in British engineering, in the power of modernity to conquer ancient ice. The ponies were Captain Oates's responsibility. Oates was a cavalry officer who paid £1,000 for the privilege of joining the expedition. He knew horses. He selected Siberian ponies because they seemed hardy, strong, more humane than driving dog teams to exhaustion and death. It was a decision made partly from sentiment, partly from incomplete knowledge. It would prove catastrophic. The dogs were almost an afterthought. Too few, handlers insufficiently trained. Scott never fully trusted dogs, never committed to learning the techniques that Norwegians and Arctic peoples had perfected. This ambivalence would haunt him. The men Scott selected were extraordinary. Dr. Edward Wilson, his closest friend, physician and scientist, deeply religious, the expedition's moral compass. Lieutenant Henry Bowers, compact and immensely strong, nicknamed Birdie for his prominent nose, reliable as sunrise. Captain Lawrence Oates, tall and taciturn, more comfortable with animals than people, stoic to his core. Petty Officer Edgar Evans, a giant of a man, powerful and skilled, the sole working-class representative who would join the final polar party. These were the men who would die together in the ice. They simply didn't know it yet. Terra Nova departed London on June 1st. Bands played, speeches rang out. It was glorious, confident, utterly British. The ship sailed south, stopping in South Africa, then Australia for final provisions. In Melbourne, everything changed. A telegram arrived, brief, devastating. Beg leave to inform you proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen, Roald Amundsen, Norwegian, experienced, ruthless. He had publicly announced plans to explore the Arctic, but he'd lied. He was going south, to the pole. The race Scott thought he owned had suddenly become a desperate sprint against perhaps the most skilled polar explorer alive. Scott's public response was measured. His expedition was scientific. The pole was merely one objective. Amundsen's presence changed nothing. Privately, it changed everything. Because Amundsen wasn't playing the same game. Where Scott brought motor sledges, ponies, and dogs, Amundsen relied solely on dog teams. Where Scott's expedition numbered dozens, Amundsen traveled light and fast. Where Scott emphasized science and British civilization, Amundsen focused purely on one goal: get there first. Terra Nova pushed into Antarctic waters in December 1910. The ship was desperately overloaded, sitting low, decks crammed with supplies and suffering animals. When they reached the Great Ice Barrier, that vast wall of frozen ocean guarding Antarctica, Scott established base camp at Cape Evans on Ross Island. Then reality began its assault. One motor sledge broke through ice while being unloaded. It sank. Gone. The remaining motors worked briefly, rumbling across ice like iron miracles. Then the cold killed them. Engines seized. Tracks broke. Within days, all the motor sledges were abandoned, expensive monuments to misplaced faith. The ponies suffered immediately. Unlike dogs, they sweated. In Antarctic cold, sweat froze on their bodies, sapping warmth and energy. They broke through surface snow while dogs ran on top. Each step was agony. Oates watched his charges struggle and knew they were doomed. During that first summer, the expedition established supply depots along the route south. The most critical was 1 Ton Depot, 130 miles from base camp. The plan called for placing it further south, but weakening ponies forced an early stop. That decision, placing 1 Ton Depot 30 miles short of the intended position, would have consequences beyond imagination. As autumn arrived, the sun spiraled toward the horizon and vanished. Winter descended. 25 men crammed into a hut 50 feet by 25 feet, divided by class. Officers one end, sailors the other, a canvas curtain marking the boundary. For 4 months they lived in darkness broken only by occasional aurora, ghostly green curtains dancing across the void. Outside, temperatures plunged to 50 below zero. Wind screamed. The darkness was absolute, crushing, maddening. Men who stepped outside roped themselves to the hut, or risked dying within yards of safety, lost in the howling black. Scott knew that somewhere to the east, Amundsen was also waiting. The Norwegian had established his base directly on the ice barrier, a risky decision but one that placed him 60 miles closer to the pole. Every calculation Scott made had to account for this disadvantage. As winter released its grip and the sun returned in late August, the men emerged pale and restless. There would be spring journeys to position final supplies. Then, in November, the assault would begin. Scott selected his teams, organized supplies down to the last biscuit, prepared to lead his men into the frozen interior. Everything depended on the journey ahead. The dream was within reach. The race had begun. And somewhere in the white silence, Antarctica waited with infinite patience, ready to teach these confident men exactly how small they were, how fragile, how utterly breakable against the indifferent vastness of ice. November 1st, 1911, 16 men prepare to leave Cape Evans for the South Pole. The sun circles endlessly overhead, never setting, bathing the ice in perpetual harsh light. Scott has planned everything meticulously. Support parties will haul supplies south, then turn back at intervals. 4 men, only 4, will make the final push to 90 degrees south. On paper, it's perfect. Antarctica doesn't care about paper. The motor sledges depart first, rumbling across the barrier. For exactly 7 miles they work. 7 miles of vindication, of British engineering triumphant. Then one engine dies, then another. Piston seize, tracks snap. Within days all 3 sledges are abandoned, useless metal corpses half buried in snow. The men who were supposed to ride must now haul everything themselves. Scott departs Cape Evans on November 1st with the pony teams. The animals struggle from the first step. The surface is soft. Ponies break through with every stride, legs plunging deep while men sink only to their ankles. Sweat freezes on their coats. Their breath comes in desperate gasps. Oates watches and says nothing. He had warned the ponies were inadequate. Nobody listened. Now he drives them forward, knowing he's driving them to their deaths, because there's no alternative. The journey south across the Ross ice shelf begins. Flat, white, endless. No landmarks, no features, nothing but ice and sky in terrible sameness. Men navigate by compass, counting steps, measuring sun angles. A mistake means wandering lost until death comes, in the white silence. The routine establishes itself. Wake. Eat pemmican and biscuits. Break camp. Harness ponies or harness yourself. March while the landscape never changes. Stop. March again. Erect tents with fingers that no longer feel. Sleep in bags that grow heavier each night as ice accumulates from your breath. Wake and do it all again. The temperature hovers around -20 Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. But this isn't even true Antarctic cold. That will come later. The ponies deteriorate. One by one they weaken beyond recovery. Oates shoots them, hating the necessity. Each dead pony means men must haul more weight themselves. Over 200 pounds per man. They lean into harnesses, straining, feet slipping. Progress measured in miles per day, sometimes only 5 or 6 despite 10 hours of hauling. On November 21st, the last pony is shot. They name the depot Shambles Camp. Blood on ice, meat carved and cached. Another miscalculation buried in snow. Ahead lies the Beardmore Glacier. 100-mile river of ice ascending from sea level to over 10,000 feet. Crevasses lurk under thin snow bridges. Men break through, dangling in harnesses over blue depths that descend into darkness. They haul each other out, shaking, and continue. Every step is gambling with death. Petty Officer Evans begins showing signs of trouble on the glacier. His hands are badly cut from handling frozen equipment. The cuts don't heal. They worsen. Swelling, infection. Evans, the strongest of them all, starts to slow. He doesn't complain. Complaining isn't done. But the others notice. Wilson, the physician, watches carefully. Says nothing. There's nothing to be done except continue. By early December, they're on the polar plateau. The altitude makes every breath an effort. The cold intensifies. The surface changes constantly, sometimes hard ice, sometimes soft snow, where every step is a fight. Scott makes a decision that surprises everyone. January 4th, just 150 miles from the pole. The plan has always been 4 men for the final push. Rations calculated for 4, tent space for 4. Scott announces he's taking 5. The final polar party. Scott, Wilson, Bowers, Oates, Evans. Bowers is shocked. He'd sent back his skis, expecting to return with the support party. Now he must continue without them, stumbling through snow while others glide. The mathematics are wrong. Rations for 4 must feed 5, but Scott wants Bowers' navigation skills, his strength, his reliability. The last support party turns back. The 5 men continue south, alone, completely alone. Their margin for error, already thin, becomes nearly non-existent. Weather worsens. Temperatures drop below -30. The surface becomes terrible, soft snow dragging at sledges. They travel on half rations, slowly starving while doing the hardest physical work of their lives. Each man burns perhaps 5,000 calories per day, consuming maybe 3,500. The mathematics are simple and inexorable. They're dying. Vitamin C deficiency, dehydration, frostbite creeping deeper with each day. All of them deteriorating. Nobody speaks of it. On January 16, 1912, Bowers spots something on the horizon, a dark shape against endless white. They approach in silence. Nobody wants to say what they are all thinking. The shape becomes clearer. A pole, fabric snapping in wind, a flag, black, Norwegian. They stand there, 5 men staring at the thing that destroys everything. Around the flag, dog tracks everywhere, paw prints in snow, clear and recent. The Norwegians traveled with dogs, fast and efficient, while Scotsmen hauled like beasts of burden. The next day, January 17th, they reach the pole itself. 90 degrees south, the bottom of the world. It should be triumph. Near the exact pole stands Amundsen's tent, pristine and mocking. Inside they find a letter, addressed to Scott. Polite, professional, asking Scott to deliver a message to the King of Norway in case Amundsen's party didn't survive their return. But Amundsen will survive. His planning was perfect, his methods proven. He's probably already halfway back to his base, eating well, traveling fast with healthy dogs. Scott reads the letter with hands that shake from more than cold. That night he writes in his diary, "The worst has happened. 800 miles hauled, 79 days of suffering. Cold and hunger and exhaustion beyond measure, for nothing. They are not first, they are second. And in exploration, in history, in everything that matters, second place is the same as last. They take photographs because the British keep records, even in defeat. Grim-faced men standing by a Norwegian flag. They plant their own flag. They take scientific readings. They do everything properly, correctly, as trained. Then, on January 19th, they turn north, 800 miles back to Cape Evans, back to the ship, back to England and the humiliation of explaining how they lost to a Norwegian who did everything better. But first they have to survive. They are already exhausted, already hungry, already damaged in ways they don't fully understand. Winter is coming, the true Antarctic cold that will make -30 feel like warmth, and now they carry defeat in their chests, a weight heavier than any sledge. The return journey begins under a shadow that will only deepen. They don't know it yet, but they're already dead men walking. The mathematics of their food, their fuel, their deteriorating bodies, it doesn't add up to survival. Evans's infected hands, Oates' frostbitten feet, though he hasn't mentioned them, the collective exhaustion, the half rations that aren't enough. Antarctica has been patient. It watched them struggle south, watched them fail at the pole. Now it will watch them try to escape. The ice doesn't care about courage or discipline or the disappointment burning in 5 men's hearts. The ice just waits, and it has already won. January 19th, 1912. 5 men turn their backs on the South Pole and begin walking north. 800 miles to Cape Evans, 800 miles of the same ice they have already crossed, but now they're exhausted, underfed, and carrying the weight of defeat. The first days of the return are brutal, but manageable. They maintain routine. Wake, eat, march, camp, sleep. the same rhythm that brought them south. But something has changed. The spirit that drove them forward is gone, replaced by grim determination to simply survive. They don't talk about losing to Amundsen. What is there to say? By late January, they're descending the Beardmore Glacier. This should be easier, going downhill instead of up, but the glacier is treacherous. Crevasses hidden under snow, ice cliffs requiring careful navigation, and the men are weaker now than when they climbed. Edgar Evans is deteriorating fastest. His hands cut and infected weeks ago have become useless. The wounds won't heal. They're swelling, festering, turning his fingers into clubs of pain. He can barely grip the sledge harness. Wilson changes the dressings each night, saying nothing about what he sees. There's nothing to be done. No antibiotics, no surgery. Just hope the body can fight the infection. It can't. Evans also suffers from frostbite, though he doesn't mention it. His nose, his cheeks, his feet, and something else is happening. Confusion, forgetfulness, difficulty with simple tasks. The others notice him becoming slower, clumsier, sometimes staring blankly as though he's forgotten where he is. They don't know it, but Evans likely has a concussion, possibly from a fall into a crevasse that he downplayed. In the cold and altitude and starvation, his brain is swelling, dying. On February 17th, while descending the glacier, Evans collapses. The others stop, gather around him. He's conscious but confused, unable to stand. His hands are grotesquely swollen, his speech is slurred. They get him into the tent, try to warm him, give him hot tea. That night Edgar Evans dies. He's 37 years old, petty officer, the strongest man in the expedition. Dead from infection, frostbite, head injury, exhaustion, the first of the 5 to fall. They bury him as best they can. There's no time for a proper grave. They cover his body with snow, say a prayer, mark the spot. Then they continue, because stopping means dying too. 4 men now. The sledge is lighter without Evans, but that's poor consolation. His death is a stark reminder of their vulnerability. If Evans, powerful, experienced Evans, can die, any of them can. All of them will. They reach the bottom of the glacier and continue across the barrier. February slides into March. The Antarctic summer is ending. Temperatures begin dropping. -30 becomes -40. The sun, which circled overhead for months, finally sets. Darkness returns, gradually at first, then faster. They're racing winter and losing. The surface becomes terrible. Soft snow that drags at the sledges like sand. Each step requires enormous effort for minimal progress. They're covering perhaps 10 miles per day, sometimes less. At this rate, they'll never reach the next depot before their food runs out. They reduce rations further. Already starving, they now eat even less. The mathematics are brutal. Burn 5,000 calories hauling sledges. Consume maybe 3,000. Your body begins consuming itself. Muscle breaks down for fuel. You grow weaker each day, which makes hauling harder, which requires more calories you don't have. It's a death spiral with only one ending. Captain Oates is suffering terribly, though he tries to hide it. His feet are badly frostbitten, have been for weeks. Each morning putting on his boots is agony. Each step is torture. The frostbite is severe. His toes are likely black, tissue dead and rotting inside his boots. He slows the group down and knows it. By mid-March, Oates can barely walk. He stumbles, falls, needs help getting up. The others must wait for him, which costs precious time and calories. They're approximately 150 miles from One Ton Depot, the major supply cache that could save them, if they could reach it. On the night of March 15th, Oates speaks to the others. He tells them to leave him in his sleeping bag. Go on without him. Save themselves. They refuse. British naval men don't abandon their companions. The next morning, March 16th, is Oates' 32nd birthday. It's also one of the worst blizzards any of them have experienced. The tent shakes in screaming wind. Visibility outside is 0. Temperature has dropped to perhaps -45. Oates wakes, struggles to sit up, looks at his companions. He says, I am just going outside and maybe some time. Then he crawls out of the tent into the blizzard. They never see him again. Everyone knows what Oates is doing. He's sacrificing himself, removing the burden he's become, giving the others a chance to survive. It's an act of extraordinary courage, walking into a storm knowing you'll be dead within minutes, frozen solid within hours. Scott writes in his diary, We knew that poor Oates was walking to his death, but though we tried to dissuade him, we knew it was the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. 3 men remain, Scott, Wilson, Bowers. They continue north, hauling the sledge that seems heavier each day despite containing less. Oates' sacrifice hasn't saved them. They're too weak, too far from safety, racing against a winter that's already won. On March 19th, they reach within 11 miles of One Ton Depot. 11 miles, a few hours' walk under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances. A blizzard descends, wind screaming at 70 miles per hour, temperature plunging, visibility 0. They pitch their tent and wait for the storm to pass. It doesn't pass. Day after day, the blizzard continues. They're trapped in their tent. Fuel running out, food nearly gone. They can't travel in these conditions. They'd be lost and frozen within minutes. But staying means slowly dying. They choose to stay. Perhaps they're too weak to travel anyway. Perhaps they know it doesn't matter. Scott continues writing his diary. His last entries are among the most famous in exploration history. March 22nd or 23rd. Blizzard bad as ever. Wilson and Bowers unable to start. Tomorrow last chance. No fuel and only 1 or 2 portions of food left. Must be near the end. March 29th. Since the 21st we have had a continuous gale. We had fuel to make 2 cups of tea apiece and bare food for 2 days on the 20th. Every day we have been ready to start for our depot, 11 miles away. But outside the door of the tent it remains a scene of whirling drift. I do not think we can hope for better things now. We shall stick it out to the end. But we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. He continues writing anyway. His last message is addressed to the public. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale. He writes individual letters. To Wilson's wife, to Bowers's mother, to his own wife Kathleen, to the mothers of other expedition members, taking responsibility, praising his men, explaining how circumstances beyond their control led to disaster. His final diary entry, undated but probably late March, "For God's sake, look after our people." Then silence. The 3 men lie in their tent, 11 miles from salvation they'll never reach. The blizzard continues howling. The cold deepens. They have no food, no fuel, no strength. They simply wait for the end. Scott lies between Wilson and Bowers, his diary and letters tucked in his sleeping bag. Outside, Antarctica continues its indifferent existence. The storm that trapped them will eventually pass. Spring will come, the sun will return, but Scott, Wilson, and Bowers will never see it. 8 months later, in November 1912, a search party from Cape Evans finds the tent. It's half buried in snow, a small mound on infinite white. Inside they find 3 frozen bodies. Scott's arm is stretched toward Wilson, as though reaching for his friend in final moments. They find Scott's diary, his letters, the geological specimens they collected near the pole, 35 pounds of rocks they hauled even while dying, because the mission was scientific and scientists don't abandon specimens. The search party buries the tent where it stands, collapsing it over the bodies, building a cairn of snow above. They erect a cross made from skis. Then they return to Cape Evans with the diary and letters that will tell the world what happened, the Scott expedition. 129 men sailed from England, 65 made it to Antarctica, 5 reached the South Pole, none of those 5 came home. November 12, 1912, 8 months after Scott's last diary entry. A search party from Cape Evans trudges south across the barrier, looking for bodies they know they'll find but desperately hope they won't. 11 miles from One Ton Depot, they spot it. A small mound in endless white, barely visible against the snow. The search party stops. Nobody speaks. They all know what's inside that mound. Apsley Cherry Garrard, the expedition's youngest member, approaches first. He had been with the last support party, had turned back when Scott selected the final 5. Now he digs away snow with bare hands, opens the tent flaps, and looks inside. 3 bodies, frozen solid. Scott lies in the center, his sleeping bag open. His left arm is stretched across Wilson's body, reaching for his friend even in death. Wilson and Bowers are peaceful in their bags, eyes closed, as though sleeping. Between them, carefully arranged, Scott's diary, his letters, and 35 pounds of geological specimens they refuse to abandon. Cherry Garrard reads the diary's last entry aloud. His voice breaks. Grown men, hardened polar explorers, stand in Antarctic wind and weep. They find Scott's letters, one addressed to Cherry Garrard himself, apologizing for not making him part of the final 5, praising his character. Cherry Garrard will carry the guilt of surviving for the rest of his life, convinced he should have pushed south to One Ton Depot with extra supplies, convinced he could have saved them. He couldn't have, but he'll never stop believing he failed them. The search party makes a decision. The bodies stay here. Moving them is impossible. They're frozen solid, and the journey back to Cape Evans is too far. The tent will be their tomb. They collapse it over the 3 men, build a cairn of snow above, erect a cross made from skis. On the cross they carve a line from Tennyson, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Then they gather the diary, the letters, the specimens, and begin the long walk back to tell the world what happened. February 10th, 1913. New Zealand. The Terra Nova docks in Lyttelton Harbor. Reporters swarm the ship, shouting questions. The expedition members descend the gangway in silence, faces grim. One word spreads through the crowd like wildfire. Dead. The news reaches London within hours via telegraph. Scott is dead. Wilson, Bowers, Oates, Evans. All dead. Britain has lost the race to the South Pole and lost 5 men in the attempt. Kathleen Scott receives the news at a dinner party. Someone hands her a telegram. She reads it, excuses herself calmly, and walks to a private room before collapsing. Her husband is dead, frozen in Antarctic ice, and she'll never see his body, never have a grave to visit. She has a 2-year-old son who will grow up without a father. That night she reads the letter Scott wrote to her in his final days. What lots and lots I could tell you of this journey. How much better it has been than lounging in comfort at home. Make the boy interested in natural history if you can. It is better than games. The letter is tender, loving, completely inadequate for the enormity of what she's lost. But it's all she has. The newspapers transform tragedy into triumph. They publish Scott's diary entries, his letters, the story of Oates walking into the blizzard with those famous last words, the image of 3 men dying 11 miles from salvation, maintaining discipline and dignity to the end. Britain doesn't mourn failure. Britain celebrates heroes. Memorial services pack churches. The king sends condolences. Parliament praises their sacrifice. Statues are commissioned. Schools teach children about British courage in the face of impossible odds. Oates becomes the ultimate symbol of self-sacrifice. Scott becomes a martyr for science and exploration. But in Norway, Roald Amundsen reads the news with complicated feelings. He won. He reached the pole first, on December 14th, 1911, 34 days before Scott. His expedition was perfectly executed. Dogs performed flawlessly. His men stayed healthy. They planted the Norwegian flag, left their message, and returned to base without drama or death. Complete success. But the world barely noticed. The newspapers had covered his achievement briefly, then moved on. Now, with Scott's death, the coverage is massive. Scott, who lost the race and died trying, receives more attention dead than Amundsen received alive and victorious. Amundsen writes carefully in his own account, "I would gladly forgo any honor or money, if thereby I could have saved Scott his terrible death." He means it. He's not a monster. He's a professional who did everything right and now watches the world praise a man who did many things wrong. The contrast is uncomfortable. Amundsen studied indigenous methods, used proven technology, planned conservatively, respected the environment. He succeeded through intelligence and preparation. Scott used experimental motor sledges that failed, ponies that suffered. He took 5 men when supplies were calculated for 4. He made decisions based partly on British pride rather than polar reality. And yet Scott is celebrated while Amundsen is barely remembered. It reveals something about what the world values. Tragic heroism over competent success. Noble failure over efficient victory. The story of men dying bravely resonates more than the story of men surviving smartly. For decades, Scott's legend grows unchallenged. Books praise his courage. His name appears on maps and monuments. A research station is built at the South Pole and named after him. Then, in 1979, everything changes. Roland Huntford publishes Scott and Amundsen, a devastating analysis arguing Scott was incompetent, his decisions killed his men, and British pride created a false hero. The book ignites furious debate. Scott's defenders call it revisionist slander. Others call it overdue honesty. The truth, as always, is complicated. Scott made mistakes, the motor sledges, the ponies, taking 5 instead of 4, placing 1-ton depot 30 miles short of the planned position. These weren't bad luck. They were bad decisions. But he also faced genuinely terrible conditions. The return journey encountered unusually cold temperatures, 10 to 15 degrees colder than normal for the season. The surface snow was particularly bad. And a blizzard did trap them 11 miles from salvation. Both things are true. Scott made errors, and he was genuinely unlucky. Modern scientists add another factor. In 1984, researchers exhumed bodies from the Franklin expedition, a different polar disaster from decades earlier. They discovered massive lead poisoning from tinned food sealed with lead solder. Could this have affected Scott's men? The expedition carried thousands of tins, hastily sealed, lead in direct contact with food, every meal potentially poisoning them. Lead causes neurological damage, impaired judgment, physical weakness. Some of Scott's decisions, carrying unnecessary weight, confusion about routes, the general deterioration, might have been lead slowly destroying their brains. We'll never know for certain. Scott's body remains in Antarctica, moving slowly with the ice sheet, eventually to break off and melt into the ocean. But the possibility adds another layer to the tragedy. Today, the South Pole hosts the Amundsen Scott Station, named for both men, finally equal in recognition. Inside, researchers work in heated comfort, conducting climate science, studying the universe, advancing human knowledge. When storms come, they shelter safely and wait them out. Nobody dies for glory anymore. We've learned that survival matters more than heroism, that careful planning beats brave suffering. These are lessons written in frozen bodies scattered across Antarctica. The tent where Scott, Wilson, and Bowers died is gone now, consumed by ice or broken apart by wind. But their geological specimens, those 35 pounds of rocks they refused to abandon, proved scientifically valuable. Fossils showing Antarctica was once warm, connected to other continents, part of ancient Gondwana. Their deaths contributed to knowledge. Whether that knowledge was worth 5 lives is a question each person must answer for themselves. On King William Island in the Arctic, far from Antarctica, there's a memorial to another expedition, the Franklin expedition that lost 129 men searching for the Northwest Passage. Both expeditions represent the same era, when national pride mattered more than individual lives, when dying gloriously seemed preferable to living cautiously. We've moved beyond that age, mostly. Scott's story endures not because he succeeded, but because he failed in a way that revealed something about human nature, the courage to continue when hope is gone, the discipline to maintain civilization's rituals even while dying, the choice to write letters to loved ones rather than surrender to despair. These aren't strategic virtues. They didn't help him survive, but they're human virtues, and they matter. Remember Scott as a flawed man who made mistakes that killed him and his companions. Remember him also as a man who faced death with dignity and left behind words that still move us a century later. Both memories are true, and somewhere in Antarctica, buried under years of accumulated snow, 3 bodies rest in their tent tomb. The ice moves them slowly toward the sea. Eventually, perhaps centuries from now, they'll be released. Until then, they remain frozen in their final moment, Scott reaching for Wilson, all 3 together, still 11 miles from the depot that could have saved them. The ice remembers nothing, but we remember.